So here we've got an example of a parameterized route. What does that mean? Well, right here we've got foo's and we have bars. So these are not parameterized routes. These are fixed routes. One is foo's and one is bars. But if we end up clicking on one of these items on the foo's component, we'll see that our URL ends up changing. So when we click on the first one, we have foo's 1, now we have foo's 2, and now we have foo's 3. And let's take a look and see how we can end up using the React router in order to set up these parameterized routes. So here's the code that's allowing this to happen. We've got a route for foo's, and notice we have this exact parameter here. And now we have a parameterized route. What I'm going to do is undo these changes and go through all the changes that we needed to do to sort of get these detailed views and have these routes with these specific parameters. So I undid the changes that allowed my parameterized routes, and I'm back to just having a list of these items. And the goal is to actually put links here so we could go and look at details. We don't really have many details, but we can still demonstrate it. The other thing here is that we've got our state, and our state is, we're putting in a little bit of a asynchronous code here to sort of mimic what would happen if we were getting our data from a server somewhere. So we've got our foo's, these are objects, we've got our switch statement here, we've got two relatively simple routes here. And what I'm going to do to start out with is that when I go and render my foo's, what I'm going to do is instead of just rendering the list items, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to use my link, which I have from my React Router DOM, and this is going to be a link too. And here this link is going to be dynamic. I can't just say what it's going to be because it's going to be dependent upon what the ID of the foo is. So here I put in an expression because the 2 is always going to be a string, and we'll say this is going to go to foo's, but we're going to use the $sign for our template literal, and this is going to be foo.id. So just with this change, if I go over here, I'll see that these are now links. And you'll notice that this still works, but there's a couple of things that are different here. Notice, first of all, that this is not highlighted because my path is no longer foo's, it's foo's with some ID. And I could even go in here and start to set this up by going over here and saying, hey, by the way, if in fact you come to us with an ID. So the way you do a parameterized route is with a colon. And this says this is a variable. Could be any number of values here for the ID. And let's go over here and we're going to put in foo, and this is not a component that exists. But what I want to show you is that it doesn't really even matter that it doesn't exist, because when I refresh this page, it's still going to show my foo's routes. And the reason why that is that I've got this inside of a switch statement. And the way that this matching works is that it's somewhat called fuzzy matching, meaning that foo's with an ID of 1 still matches this top route. So it never makes it to this next route. If I want to be specific and say, hey, look, wait a second, this is only for an exact match, now when I refresh, I'll get an error message that says, hey, look, wait a second, I'm trying to render this route for you, but it doesn't exist. So let's set up this route. And the way that I'm going to do that is, first of all, just to go over here and put in, and we're going to want to return something. So I'm going to do a return. And for the moment, I'm just going to return an HR tag. So now at least I've got my foo component. And if I go over here, it's just giving me back the horizontal rule. Now what I want is I want to get the details on these foos. What's kind of interesting here is that if I end up going over here and I grab my props, what I could do here is I could take these props. I could either get them individually, or these are my router props. I could splat them out. And what this is going to do is it's going to take all those router props. There's about 4 or 5 of them. But the one that I'm interested in is I want to find out which ID the user ended up setting here, because I've got my foo's already, and I only want to display one of the foo's. So what I could do here is if I go up to my foo's, let's just take a look at my foo component, and let's look at what we have in the props. And if I console.log the props, I'll see I've got a bunch of things here. First of all, first I have no foos, then I have my 3 foos, and the thing that I'm interested in is this match value. Because this match value is going to tell me, hey, look, you gave me a parameterized route, I'm in a parameterized route, and so I'm going to tell you what you match on, what parameters you match on. You have a param for ID, and the value is 1. So what that allows me to do is to go over here and say ID equals match params ID. And let me console log the ID. And if I refresh this, this is going to be, props match params ID. And if I refresh this, I'll see that I've got an ID of 1. But if I clicked on 3, I've got an ID of 3. If I clicked on 2, I've got an ID of 2. And if I look at this value, I'll see that the type of this value is going to be a string. Now, I've also got my foos here as well. If I console.log props.foos, I'll see eventually I'll have no foos, but eventually I'm going to have 3 foos. Notice that these IDs are integers, but my match params, because they're on a URL, they're always strings. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to find the foo that I'm interested in. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to say foo equals props.foos I want to find. And I'm going to look at each foo, and I'm going to say I want the one where the ID is equal to the ID. But don't forget, that's a string. So I'm going to multiply it by 1 to get a number. And what I'm going to do here, I'm going to be optimistic, which is going to kind of mess me up a little bit here. And I'll put this in an H1 just so we can see the difference. It'll look a little bit silly, but that's fine. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to put in foo.name. And so if I end up doing that, and I refresh this page, what I'm going to find out is I end up getting an error. Reason why I end up getting an error is, don't forget, this is asynchronous. So the first time through, when I don't have any foos, it can't find the foo. So sometimes you have to be a little bit defensive. Now, one thing that React doesn't mind you doing, you could say, hey, look, if in fact you can't find the foo, then just don't return anything. There's nothing to see. Okay? Maybe it's loading from the server. And now, if I'm on the foos, I can go over here and say foo3, foo2, foo1. I've got the details. My back button ends up working accordingly, right? Because they're just hash changes. And if I wanted this to stay highlighted, what I could end up doing is going up here and just saying, hey, look, if the path starts with foos. The other thing that I would probably end up doing here is that let's actually make this a little bit easier to read, less dots, by saying what we're really interested in is the match and also the foos. And then we could get rid of the word props here and props over there. And it's just clear what we're interested in. And again, the reason why we're able to do this is that we're passing 2 things into this component. We're passing all of our foos, and we're also splatting out the props. Again, if we wanted to, we don't have to splat out all the props. We could go over here and say, hey, look, we only want the match. And in fact, all we're going to send you is the match. And here we're sending exactly what this component is expecting. Again, not necessary, but maybe would end up reading a little bit better, and it still ends up working.